All right, so we started talking about imperialism. Imperialism is that belief that is that practice where states that are industrialized are conquering non-industrialized states. The one of the largest chunks of land that Europeans did not have colonies in at the start of this unit is Africa. European powers are going to go into Africa and colonize Africa from 1750 to 1900, and things are going to get really, really, really bad for the African people as a result of this. Um, Actually, things in Africa are going to get even worse than they were in period two. And you might take a second, go to Quattro. Period two was when the transatlantic slave trade was taking place, and Africa was being ripped apart by the wars to gather to get slaves. How could it possibly be worse? And it's because now the Europeans are coming. They're coming for your land now. In period two, all the Europeans really had in Africa were trade posts. Now they're going to come in and colonize and take over the whole thing. And here's why. It goes to the abolition of slavery. Many of the big European powers that were industrialized, Britain, France, and places where like the markets were going to, the United States, are going to abolish slavery. Now, that's awesome. Slavery is a terrible, awful, awful, awful thing. And the slave trade was an awful thing. And the abolition of slavery was a direct result of the ideas in the Enlightenment that said this process was wrong. So all these countries are going to get rid of slavery. You'd think that would be an awesome thing for Africa, but it kind of isn't, because when these European states that were industrialized, Britain, France, Germany, and then some smaller ones that we're not going to talk about today, realized that they weren't getting anything out of Africa anymore, they start to go into Africa itself, exploring, well, what other things of wealth can we find? Can we extrapolate? And because of the racist ideals of things like social Darwinism and the civilizing mission, they justify colonization of Africa in their mind by saying they need us, or we have the right to do this. Well, things really pick up in 1870. There is a famous conference held in Berlin that we don't have to talk about that kind of set the rules for what colonization would look like in Africa. And European states from 1870 to the end of this year are going to rush to colonize as much of Africa as they can. By 1900, almost all of Africa is going to be colonized by Britain, France, Germany, and some lesser European industrial powers like Belgium in Africa. What are they going for? They're going for natural resources. And boy, are there a lot of natural resources in Africa that an industrial power would be interested in. Things like gold and rubber, which is incredibly important for industrialization. And then in South Africa, diamonds. And one of the things that's important to remember is these industrial powers are not working together. They are competing. They are rivals. And this rivalry between these powers becomes incredibly intense. And it's going to lead to an issue in the start of period four, a little thing I like called World War One. Colonization of Africa is at least a cause of that. But we're going to talk again. I'm just foreshadowing things. Europeans are going to use both diplomacy and warfare to build empires in Africa. Now, this is a great little before and after map of what colonization in Africa looked like. Before 1880, most of Africa was not controlled by European powers, controlled by lots of different little European entities. After 1880, as this race gets going, things are about to change. You need to know some of the regions that are going to be colonized. You need to know that for Britain, they have Egypt and they have South Africa. Why is Egypt important to Britain? Because they just dug the Suez Canal, and they need control of that warp zone to their most important colony, which is India. Another thing that comes out of Egypt is one of the world's three for my English speaking friends, let me try this again. Egypt is one of the world's three leading cotton exporting regions on earth, and Britain really needs Egyptian cotton to keep their industrialism going. And then South Africa. Diamonds are in South Africa. And yeah, the British are really interested in that. In northwestern Africa, the French will build a huge colonial empire. It looks impressive on the map. Remember that a lot of this is sand. All of this right here is Sahara Desert, but they are also going to extract resources. Now, interestingly, these dark browns are German colonies. What do you need to know about German colonies? Well, Britain got the best stuff because they were the first ones to colonize Africa. Last one to the games were the Germans because Germany had just barely become a state by this point, a unified empire. The Germans started colonies in Africa for all the reasons that industrial powers do. They want to try to have access to natural resources. They felt it was a nationalist movement. Hey, look at us. We're a global power. It looks impressive on a map. We have colonies too. But here's the problem with most of the colonies that the Germans have. They're pretty much worthless. Because they were the last ones in, they got the leftovers. And most of their colonies weren't worth anything. But there's something important about them. Anywhere you see a really rich, powerful, thriving, economically important British colony, right next door by the end of this unit, you're going to see a German colony. And the Germans are going to start to look at British colonies with longing eyes. And that's going to be an issue in period one. So much of what we talk about from here to the end of this unit is just leading up to the first big thing we talk about in period 4, which is World War I. If you know anything about World War I, the Germans and the British are on opposite sides. And the German desire to expand and take over British colonies is going to be a cause of that. So all this is going to come back and bite all these European powers in the butt ultimately. And then I want you to look like right here. Now, this is the colony of a group of people we have not spent much time talking about, and we're not. Belgium. We're going to come back and talk about the Belgians here. This is the colony of the Congo. They're going to get rubber out of this colony, and what we're really going to focus on is how the Belgians treat the natives here. Fun story, not great. So, one of the big themes about the British in or all the European powers in Africa is natives are fairly powerless to resist. This makes sense. What do all the European powers have? They all have guns. You know, by the end of this period, I think I've told you this already, Europeans have machine gun technology. Lots of these indigenous African tribes they're fighting have spears. It's just not a fair fight. And the natives are fairly powerless to resist the encroachments of Europeans coming onto their land. It's a really, really, really sad story. And it's a desperate story. And Europeans in Africa treat natives horribly, especially in Belgium, where the atrocities the Belgians commit against the natives is just truly one of the great. It's almost a genocide. It's so bad. And these hungry European wolves are in Africa just to take resources and take, and they keep driving natives off land that had been theirs for hundreds and hundreds of years and land that they felt spiritually connected to. And again, the Europeans are also justifying this, why they have the right to do this based on the racist ideals we talked about earlier. Well, it gets so bad that in some places the natives are desperate to resist and to fight back. I need to give you a story of a group of natives who are resisting European encroachment. And I need to give you a story where this resistance is based, at least in part, on native belief systems, native religious belief systems in Africa. And I want you to actually read the story. I'm not going to tell you the story because I want you to read it. This is one of the most interesting stories I've ever seen or heard in history, and it's also just breathtakingly sad about how desperate a group of people are to believe in anything that would give them hope in resisting the Europeans who are coming in and taking humongous chunks of their land. It's called the Zosa cattle killing movement. I've got the link for you right here. You're going to read this at the end of class, and oh my God, is this an incredible and insanely sad story. But you need to know the Zosa cattle killing movement is an example of natives trying to resist European encroachment on their land by any means necessary. Now, by the end of this unit, you're going to see a global British Empire. The British were the first ones to industrialize. Because of that, they're the first ones to become an imperial power. You must know what the British Empire looks like. They have the most valuable colonies on Earth. Their wealth is unquestioned. They're going to control places like Canada, Egypt, South Africa, South Asia. We talked about that already. Australia and New Zealand. They also colonize a big chunk of China. There's a reason it doesn't show up as red in China, because they do a special type of imperialism in China. Just know they control China too. Like for right now, just know that. We'll get to the details of that insanely sad story later on. They're going to build the Suez Canal between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean. We talked about this, which is an incredibly important cog in their empire. They can have this global empire because they've built the most powerful navy on Earth. Their power there is unquestioned. They're going to use colonies to provide industrial resources for them and for their marketplaces. So they're going to get natural resources like cotton from Egypt and India, sail them back to England. British factories are going to turn these things into finished cotton textiles, and then they're going to sell these things all over the world, including to their colonists. And the British Empire has just become insanely wealthy as a result of that. In some instances, the British will send settlers to their colonies. How do you know a part of the world once upon a time was a British settler colony? And it's very, very, very simple. There's white people there today that are Christian that speak English. South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. These are all examples of British settler colonies in period 3. There are places they settled, but that they colonized, but they also sent settlers to. Not India, not Egypt. It's not all the places, but places that have large populations of white people today, Caucasians who are Christian that speak English. Then once upon a time, you were a British colony. One of the things that all of these places have in common is breathtaking racism and racial issues, because settlers are coming, and they're coming to drive natives off of their land. And they're going to take the best land for themselves and kind of push natives to the side. They're going to create economic and government systems in these places that benefit themselves and just kind of leave the natives struggling for power. If you know anything, like South Africa has an incredible history of racism. And boy, do I mean horrible racism. Things like apartheid and a caste system that puts whites at the top. We'll talk about that in period 4, but a lot of you know that South Africa has had an incredible history with racism. Australia creates something in this period, even though there were no white people in Australia at the start of this unit. By the end of it, there's a system in place called the White Australia policy, where it becomes the official policy of Australia to make Australia white. How do you think that works out for Indigenous people in Australia? I'm gonna argue not that great. Canada. Oh, Canada. Yeah, even today they have breathtakingly terrible racist issues with how they treat Indigenous people in Canada. So racism is a common thread amongst all these places where they're going to send white settlers. But you have to know examples of British settler colonies. So you need to be able to look at a map and say, oh, that's the British Empire by the key territories they control. You have to be able to say, oh, why are they able to build this empire? Because they're the first to industrialize. And those are the first ones that have these excess resources, and they're going to use these colonies to produce natural resources for their factories, and then take those goods that they have, turn it into a finished industrialized product, and export it. And they're going to export it to those same colonies. So this is the big themes of the day. African imperialism, not great, and then start to get a kind of a bigger picture idea of what the global British Empire will actually look like. Got any questions? Put them in the comments. I'm about to give you guys your work. You guys have an awesome, awesome day. Hello there, sexy.